My guest today is Professor Timothy Buschman, who's Assistant Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at Princeton University. His research aims to understand how the brain accomplishes intelligent and rational behavior by guiding our actions towards a goal. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so thanks for doing this. So I was looking at all your papers, Tim. You appeared to be really productive during the pandemic. Many papers coming out in 2021. But I want to start with sort of the review paper, Balancing Flexibility and Interference in Working Memory. So you say working memory is central to cognition, flexibly holding the variety of thoughts needed for complex behavior. Yet, despite its importance, working memory has a severely limited capacity, holding only 3 to 4 items at once. This is really fascinating. I have a lot of mad neuroscientists, Tim, but I'll say this again. I often see some relationships to sort of the computing world. So this sounds more like a cache in a computer, right? So you need this information. It's very important. You don't need it for a long time, but you need it to make a decision to do something with it, and then you can, sort of discard it. But there is sort of a competition between capacity and the usefulness of this information, right? So before we get the details of this, Tim, so a lot of people know about short and long-term memory in the brain, and working memory, I would imagine, is distinctly different from either one of those, right?
Yeah. So typically when we think about memory in the brain, right? So how do you memory is very important, right, for behavior in general, because if you think of very simple organisms, they kind of have this very short loop, right? They get stimuli that come into them from the outside world, and then they make a response. And so somewhere along evolution, we kind of opened up that loop. We broke that loop where we started having memory systems that allow us to change how we're responding to the immediate world as a function of what we've experienced in the past, as a function of sort of what our goals are, what we want to accomplish in the future. And so memory really is important for this. And so when we think about memory, we think about it generally as kind of falling into two forms: short-term memory and long-term memory, as sort of you refer to. And then working memory is kind of a special form of short-term memory, and that I think has sort of evolved alongside more of sort of cognitive control. So how do we control our own thoughts? And so, yeah, so if we think about memory broadly, we have this short-term memory, we have this long-term memory, and they're interesting systems, and they're interesting sort of different needs that each system needs to have, right? So long-term memory, you want to be able to remember things, obviously, for a very long time. You want to have a very high capacity, right? So, and we see that in our long-term memory systems. You can remember things from when you were a child, and you can remember many different things. As far as we know, there's really no kind of upper limit in how many things you can remember in long-term memory. And so, of course, the neuroscience of long-term memory is really focused on how you solidify these memories actually in the hardware of the brain itself. You change the way that neurons are talking to one another, how they're coupled with one another to sort of store and lock in those memories. Short-term memory is a different thing, right? Short-term memory, as you were sort of alluding to, with like a cache in a computer system, or random access memory, or RAM systems in computers, they're much more flexible, right? They're much more plastic. They don't last very long. Like, information in there doesn't last very long. You put something in there, and then in a computer, right, if you turn off the computer, or if you start a new program, then what is in that memory gets overwritten, gets forgotten. And there seems to be a similar sort of thing in short-term memory in the brain, which is that you can remember things for a short period of time when they're kind of relevant, but then you can very flexibly move and remember something else. And so that's sort of this short-term aspect. And the neuroscience, there's lots of different ways in which we've thought about how short-term memory might be represented in the brain. in general, and of course this isn't true like 100% of the time, and there's lots of different theories out there, but in general we tend to think about short-term memory as being more activity dependent. So it's really in the pattern of activity that's going on in the brain at any moment in time.
Yeah, I was really surprised by this capacity limitation, Tim. 3 to 4 items, whatever items mean in this context.
Yeah.
There's always been this hypothesis that humans are not very good at multitasking. In some sense, is this related to that?
I think that's a very deep, very good question. I think at the end of the day, it probably is. It probably has to do with how many things that you can focus on. As you pointed out, like what do we mean by item? What do we mean by thing? I think that's a good question. I'm happy to talk about that in more detail, because I think that's a fundamental question. But yeah, I think that these two things are very related, right? And there's really, I think, a good question about why is there this capacity limitation, right? I mean, so we're talking about working memory and short-term memory as being sort of activity dependent. So it depends on kind of like what pattern of activity there is. So like, each individual neuron in the brain has some sort of activity that it's producing at each moment in time. There's billions of neurons in the human brain. And so why do you end up with 3 or 4 items? Like that just seems very strange. Why can't you do, remember a billion things, right? And I think the answer is sort of what I try to kind of lay out in that paper that you were referencing at the beginning, is that maybe one of the constraints on this is there's a trade-off between how flexible a system is and what its capacity is, and so again, if we want to kind of go back to the computer as a sort of a way to think about things, you can have specialized systems that are very, very good at doing specific things, right? So you can have like an adder, like an add numbers incredibly fast, right? But if you then go and have it try to do something else, it can't. And so the idea is there's a system that's very good at one thing, but not very flexible at doing other things. And the idea is that in the brain, you have a similar sort of constraints, right? That you can either devise systems and grow systems and learn systems that are really good at doing something, or you can have something that's a little bit more flexible. And working memory is kind of at this heart of this flexibility, and allowing us this sort of, working memory acts as this kind of like workspace in which you could sort of place thoughts and manipulate them and use them. And so you can think of anything, right? And that's kind of the beauty of working memory is this incredible flexibility. And what we propose is that this comes at the cost of not being able to do too many things at once, right? You kind of are trading off some of this capacity in order to maintain this flexibility.
I want to dig a little deeper into that trade-off. So flexibility against capacity, it's not completely intuitive to me, and obviously I don't know anything about this. So I could envision a system that is, from a capacity perspective, let's say it's unlimited, but sorts of flexible. If I have a very large capacity system, it allows me to push information around, so to speak. And there is a different type of flexibility that comes with it, right? So why is capacity and flexibility competing in this context?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that the idea is that how information is represented in the brain is, again, in this, you have lots of neurons, let's say hundreds of millions of neurons that are sort of involved in any particular thought at any moment in time. And it's really the pattern of activity across these neurons that's really important for this. And so if you think about all of these neurons, right, then you can have a lot of different patterns that you can put in, right? And so that's what we mean by flexibility, is that there are a lot of different ways in which you can have a lot of different patterns that you can have, which means that you can represent a lot of different types of information, right? So red might have a certain pattern of activity, and then the color green has a different pattern of activity. And then if you think about, elephants, it's going to have another pattern of activity, and red elephants is going to have yet another pattern of activity. So there's all of this flexibility inherent in that distributed nature of things. But this comes at the cost of basically using all of those neurons for representing that one individual item. And so if you try to put something else in there, they begin to compete with one another. The two representations kind of overlap a little bit, and they begin to interfere. And as you add a third item, it overlaps a little bit more and interferes a little bit more. And at some point, as you add a fourth or a fifth or a sixth item, they overlap too much and they begin to degrade, right? So your memory for any particular thing might get worse, or you might even forget something. And so you may, try to remember 5 things, but end up remembering 4 or 3 items. So that's the idea. Yeah. And the trade-off, right, is that you could reduce the flexibility by using less neurons to represent any individual thing, right? You could say, let me just take 1,000 neurons. But that is kind of like, if you're familiar with like bit depth in computers, right? It's like the number of different patterns you could store in 100 neurons is very different than you could store in, say, in a million neurons. And so that's the trade-off here, is that, yeah, you could have more of these stores that are kind of non-overlapping with one another, but then each store is a little bit less flexible. And it seems like likely what the brain's doing is trading off between these two things. So it has a very flexible store, and then it has these very specific stores at the same time, and it uses specific ones when it can, to do specific behaviors. But then when it needs something flexible so that you can think about, say, pink elephants, then that's going to rely on this very flexible working memory store.
So is sort of the interference that is issue. So I'm thinking there's some sort of a inverted U-type relationship here. So if you have, very large capacity and you have a lot of information going in there, you can't really control how they're going to interrelate to each other. And on the left side of that distribution, you have very few neurons, and you don't have that much interference in the sense that you cannot take too much information. So in some sense, you limit capacity to reduce interference. Is that the way to think about it?
I guess I think about the other way around, which is that as you try to put more and more things in there, they're more likely to interfere with one another. And because of that interference, that is effectively, when we say that there's a limited capacity, what we're really saying is that if you add 3 or 4 items into the same representation, right? So if you try to represent 3 or 4 things at once, that there's going to be more interference than if you're only representing 2 of them. And so this kind of actually comes back to this question that we were talking about before, which is like, what is an item, right? And of course, that's a very nebulous, and we don't really have a great description or really understanding of what an item is in neuroscience. I think that's actually one of the kind of big key remaining questions, is what is an item. But what I can say, right, is that what counts as an item really varies, right? So if the classic example is probably a little bit outdated at this point because nobody ever uses phone numbers anymore. But if you think back to phone numbers, right, they were 7 digits long, and 7 is obviously higher than 3 or 4. And so in order to help people remember what do phone numbers do, they're sort of chunked up into 2 items, really, right? There's that sort of 3-digit and then a 4-digit follow-up, at least in the US. And that's really key, I think, to taking something that could have been 7 items and turning it into 2 items, right? And so this is, I think, a good example of how just changing what we're calling an item can change how they interfere, and all of a sudden you're very good at remembering phone numbers, or you can be very good at remembering phone numbers, but you would be pretty poor if I just gave you 7 digits, random digits to remember. Unless you were chunking them yourself, right? So that process is called chunking, this process of grouping things together into an item. In neuroscience, we call this chunking, or in psychology, we call it chunking. And so the idea is that when you chunk, what you're doing is you're forming a new representation, right? That's representing those things together, and that representation is more compact, meaning that it's less likely to interfere with other things. And so, yeah, there's just that's the sort of idea right now. And again, like a lot of this is new research that's been going on. We're trying to understand what is an item. Is this true, right? Do we really see, as you sort of group things together into new items and form new items, do they do these representations change in a way that they don't interfere with one another as much? And yeah.
Yeah, so it sounds like, Tim, it's possibly trainable. So suppose I have 4 different computers that I'm working on, and I'm, writing an essay on one, I'm doing some coding on the second one, and I'm watching the stock market on the third one, I'm doing something else on the fourth one. I could actually chunk, so to speak, those 4 computer activities into 4 boxes. And I might be able to switch back and forth between those boxes without any sort of working memory interference, because they are distinct activities. And so when we say capacity, it doesn't mean the ability of the brain to remember. It means essentially when you have interference, you will lose information if they're sort of kind of interacting with each other. Right? Is it the way to think about it?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly right. It's that as you try to do too many things or remember or think about too many things at once, they'll begin to interfere. And you see this also in behavior, right? So as you were alluding to before, this capacity in working memory, I think, is very fundamentally related to our inability to, say, multitask. Because when we are trying to multitask, we're trying to do, again, a very similar thing. We're trying to engage in multiple behaviors at the same time, which is going to necessarily lead to multiple representations, which are going to interfere with one another. Now, there's some beautiful work from John Cohen, who's a colleague here of mine at Princeton. He's, for example, shown that if you learn a task to the point where it becomes its own separate kind of representation, right? And you could think about this even in the extreme, right? Like of even through evolution, pulling out some really fundamental computations and putting them in separate parts of the brain, keeping them away from the thinking parts of the brain, right? And so, for example, breathing. We breathe, we walk down the street, right? You can do all these things, and they don't interfere with your ability to think. And it's never that you are thinking so hard that you forget to breathe, right? And the idea is that the reason for this is because that's been pulled out and it's been put on into like a separate circuit that's just dedicated for breathing. And so what happens if you, say, do practice something a lot is that you essentially, what you're doing is you're kind of pulling out or carving out part of the brain that's going to be dedicated machinery for that particular task, right? So if you learn to play the piano and you practice the piano over and over and over at a particular piece over and over and over, right? Then you get this experience of being able, it basically plays itself, right? You're not even really thinking about it. You're checking in once in a while, but you can think about other things and you're still playing the piano. And it's because you've kind of pulled these things apart and they're no longer interfering with one another. Much like you're sort of chunking thoughts, you can kind of chunk behaviors as well.
Yeah, so in the modern context, Tim, driving is an example, I would imagine. We almost automatically drive after a while. You could be doing a lot of thinking while you're driving. It seems like you have delegated a set of heuristics, activities, expectations. It's changing data, which is very interesting, right? It's changing data, but you delegated that to a part of the brain that is autonomously doing it for you.
Yeah, and this is where the driving then becomes dangerous, right? Because you rely too much on that, right? And that's when you get yourself in trouble when there's a situation that's unexpected or there's some deviation from the plan, right? That requires this you're paying attention. It requires working memory. It requires all those cognitive control processes to step in to sort of solve a solution, right? You're driving and all of a sudden, the truck in front of you blows a tire, right? Now you have to think and calculate and do all that. If you're not paying attention, if you're texting, if you're on a phone call, even hands-free, right? Like, you're pulling your attention away from what's in front of you, and that's gonna slow your reaction time. You're less likely to see what's going to happen. That's when you get in trouble, and I think bad things can happen. So yeah, I think that's a great example of how effective you can be at sort of developing systems that can do really complicated things, right? I mean, we don't have, or I guess we're just starting to now get to the point where we can have AI drive to the extent that like human kind of autopilot does much better than that, right? Without thinking, as you were saying, right? And so it's a really sophisticated system that can do quite well. And just like the computer AIs have trouble when they see something new and unexpected, the same thing's true for humans, is that if you get into a situation where it's something new and unexpected, that's when you have to kick in this other system, this thoughtful system that's sort of sitting on top of the mindless system, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. So it seems from an evolutionary perspective, the basis. Let me know if I'm thinking about it the correct way. So, working memory is sort of a survival mechanism. The line jumps out when you least expected. Something fell from the tree when you weren't anticipating. Whatever the case may be, you want a bunch of data to be held in the working memory so that you can make a sort of a quick decision and a quick action to survive. Is that sort of the reason it exists?
I think, yeah, it's tricky, right? Because a lot of those sort of situations or examples are very. Those are situations where you're gonna make a almost innate automatic response. You don't want to think, right? Like if a lion's jumping out at you, you don't want to be thinking very deeply about what. How hungry is that lion, and like what really should be the best way for me to escape? Like, no, you just want to get out of there, right? And so I think this is another sort of point of there's always trade-offs, right, in behavior, and how long you spend contemplating and thinking about something comes at the cost of what in neuroscience and psychology is known as opportunity cost, right? You're losing the opportunity to do something else. And sometimes that could be very costly, right? Like if you're thinking too much and a tiger's coming at you. Other times, right, it's not, right? I mean, like, I think there's lots of modern day examples where, maybe you were late and, pulling the trigger and buying Bitcoin, right? And so you missed the explosion, and so you're on the falling side of the curve, right? So that's an opportunity cost, right? Where you've missed the opportunity to make money. And so I think there's always this trade-off, right, on how much do you want to deliberate and how long should you deliberate on something. And I think, so from the way I think about it is from an evolutionary perspective, that working memory kind of came along when we needed to do, when we really needed to be able to develop generalized intelligence, when we wanted to be able to handle novel situations that also weren't things that, weren't going to be innately, born into us, right? So like tigers or something moving at you quickly, right, is going to be an innate response. Every animal, humans included, is going to dodge or move away from something coming at them quickly. And so like, yeah, so it's sort of like tough, right? Because you can have a novel situation. I've never had a tiger jump at me, but I'm pretty sure if a tiger jumped at me, I would still move away from it pretty quickly. So that's a novel situation, but I think it's still probably relying on some of these innate systems. Whereas, yeah, I think working memory is playing more in this kind of generalized intelligence way of trying to be creative, put things together in ways that you haven't really seen before, maybe be able to predict what's going to come up in the future. Okay, if I do this, then this might happen in the world, particularly for social interactions. This is really important, right? How my response, how is it going to, impact somebody else and how, their behavior towards me? And so, yeah, I think it plays more of that role in this kind of higher order thought.
That's really interesting, Tim. So, what you're saying is that there's a set of instinctual, innate reactions for survival. Working memory is not really adding a lot of value. You're sort of instinctually reacting to a stimulus that to survive. On the other hand, on the other side of the spectrum, you have heuristics, um, long experiences, lot of data. You have reduced that to heuristics, and you stored it somewhere. You don't need working memory anymore, like playing baseball or playing an instrument after having done it so many times. You have no use for working memory on that side once you reduce that to heuristics and stored it.
Yeah, if anything, working memory is bad in that example.
Working memory is bad.
Yeah.
So it's sort of in the middle where you want to experiment a little bit in the sense that you have some new data coming in and you want to utilize it in the most sort of flexible fashion, or really use the maximum value from that new information that came to you in some fashion. That's where working memory is most valuable.
And I think, yeah, and when you want to simulate possible outcomes, right? So if I'm at this state now and I do action A, then what will happen in the future? And then you can rewind, right, and say, okay, let me start again, right? So that's really, I think, where working memory becomes very useful, both in looking at the recent past. So, okay, something novel just happened to me. Let me kind of remember it and dissect what happened and understand what happened, but also looking forward and be able to say, okay, can I simulate what's going to happen in the future? And that's, again, like I think a key, really relies on the flexibility of working memory, both of those. Yeah.
I know there's some sort of differing opinions around sort of the larger system. What is the effect of the prefrontal cortex? Who is ultimately making these decisions after information is shuttled through the working memory? What's our sort of so I want to touch on one of your other papers. Shared mechanisms underlie the control of working memory and attention. You say cognitive control guides behavior by controlling what, when, and how information is represented in the brain. For example, attention controls sensory processing, top-down signals from prefrontal to parietal cortex strengthen the representation of task-relevant stimuli. A similar selection mechanism is thought to control the representations held in mind in working memory. So if you go beyond the working memory, how is it sort of connected with the rest of the brain?
Yeah, I think so. In this paper, we were trying to understand how do you control both what is in working memory, but also more broadly, what's coming in through your sensory systems. And so, we've talked a lot about working memory and how it has this limited capacity. Visual processing also has a fairly limited capacity, right? We have this percept that we can actually see everything at once, but we don't really. And instead, what we do is we're sort of moving our attention, we're shifting our eyes around the sort of world around us and sort of gathering specific pieces of information. And so both of these systems, right, have this capacity limitation in them. And I think that actually they have the same reason, right? So it's interference in both cases that's limiting the capacity. And so, as we talked about, right, there is this reason for it, I think, at least because of this flexibility, the advantage of flexibility. But the brain, of course, through evolution, presumably said, well, this also is very limiting to us. So if you, for example, if you were to measure the capacity of working memory in an individual, right, and people have done this. Ed Vogel at University of Chicago, for example, has done a lot of these things where he gives a lot of undergrads a test to measure how many items they can hold, right? And it turns out some people are really good. They can hold 7 items at once, and some people are not so good. They can only hold 2 items. And in the middle, there's kind of 3 or 4 is kind of the average, right? But if, like with anything in humans, like there's going to be variance around that average. And it turns out that the people who can hold more, right, 5 or 6 items, tend to do better on tests of fluid intelligence, right? So if you give them an IQ test, any of the IQ tests, they tend to score higher than somebody who has a working memory capacity of 2 or 3. And in some way that makes sense, right? I mean, like if you've ever taken an IQ test, right, oftentimes they involve like, looking at multiple things and trying to figure out like how they relate to one another. And so if you can hold more information in mind, then like you can put them together in different ways. And so I think it makes sense why you would score better on those tests. So one of the things that Ed did is he looked at, well, what's driving this variability? And it turns out that a lot of the variability from one individual to another seems to be how well they control working memory. You might think, oh, some people just have bigger brains, right? And that's why they can hold 5 or 6 items, and some people have smaller brains, they can only hold 2. That doesn't seem to be the case. Instead, it seems to be that they're just better about protecting working memory, right? So the people who can hold 5 or 6 only let in the useful information and they ignore any distracting information. Whereas the people who can only hold 2 or 3 are remembering 2 or 3 of the things that they're supposed to, but then they're also remembering other random things that they're not supposed to be remembering. And so it really highlights the importance of this kind of control of working memory. And in general, control of behavior, right? So again, with attention, the attention is your ability to kind of selectively look at a particular sensory stimuli. Again, like it's very important for you to be able to control and direct where you're looking, and you need to be able to look at the right things. And if you don't, then you're not going to do as well as somebody who is looking at the right things. And so I think all this sort of highlights the importance of this kind of control system that's kind of sitting on top of working memory, and it's sitting on top of attention, and utilizing these resources to the best of its ability. And so that's really what this study is about, is trying to understand this control mechanism and where it's coming from.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So it's not the CPU, it's the cache. If you can hold more stuff, you probably get better results.
No? I think this control mechanism would be kind of like the CPU or the program even, right? That's controlling what gets into cache. If you put cache is limited, right, most of the time, and so you have, if you fill up cache with a bunch of junk, right, and you're only using a small part of it, then you're going to have to be moving things in and out all the time, which is going to take more time. It's going to slow you down, right? And so yeah, I think of it more as this kind of the program, really. Yeah,
sort of filtering information.
Yeah.
Or letting in the highest value information to that limited capacity space so that it could be processed more efficiently. So what I want to ask you, it's not in the paper, do we have any data that shows this is, you could improve this capability with practice?
Yeah, this is a good question. So, I mean, about probably 10 years ago, there was this big brain training fad, where a lot of these video games came out about how you could train your working memory, and I mean that's in reality what they're all trying to do. It was very popular for a while. That motivated, of course, a lot of studies. In general, the answer seems to be, unfortunately, no. Not in a general way, right? So if I give you a particular task, right? So if I ask you to play a particular game, right, on your phone, like some specific brain training game, you can improve performance on that game, of course, right? And it has to do with this control mechanism, right? You'll get better at putting the right information into working memory, and so the effective capacity, right? How much of your working memory store that you're using for good purposes will go up. But that doesn't tend to really generalize to other tasks. So if I then give you a different task, it's not that all of a sudden you're better at that task as well. And so, you know, there's some hints in the literature. I mean, some people have published that, yes, you can improve performance, but yeah, there's, right, the way that you publish a paper, of course, in science is that you have to have a positive results, right? And so, you know, this isn't, I'm not, right, I mean, the answer is like lots and lots of people have tried. There's been very few papers published saying, look at this positive result. And so the implication tends to be, it's not the biggest effect in the world. Now that doesn't mean that it's not good for you, right? I mean, I think there's good evidence that staying active and thinking, and no matter what you're doing, is definitely good for you long term. But it's not like you can necessarily improve it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so that's really interesting. So in some sense, if that were true, what you're saying is that it's sort of hardware limiting. And if hardware is, sort of genetically controlled, then, you're sort of endowed with that domain controller, the capacity of that cache. Clearly, if you put an app on it and you keep doing that app, that process will get better, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the whole system generalizes, as you say.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we're still just learning about what the mechanisms are of this controller and how it works, and what controls the controller. So what limits the controller or what leads to a different controller from one individual to another individual. I mean, I think, again, there's going to be trade-offs, right? So I think there's going to be advantages to having, strong control in certain situations, and there's going to be advantages to having weak control in other situations. And so both on an evolutionary time scale as well as sort of in like our day-to-day lives. And so I don't want to make it sound like, yeah, if you have weak control, you're never going to be successful, right? I mean, I think the answer is like, that's part of who you are, and that's going to lead to you having a certain set of skills and abilities that are going to make you kind of unique to you. But yeah, I think it's a very good question about like, what is it that is constraining this? Is it neuromodulatory changes, right? So there's all sorts of different neuromodulators that are in the brain, and it could be changes in the receptors or the expression of neuromodulators. It could be learned through development. So yeah, I think all this is really open and really interesting questions.
The other sort of fad, or I don't know if it's a fad, but it used to be that an idea that if you train your kid, even before the kid is born, introducing, music and all sorts of things very, very early, then the brain appears to develop a lot faster. And do we have any evidence for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know, so I'm hesitant to say anything strong. Yeah, that's sort of outside my field. Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, environment has a very large effect on cognitive development and on even the gross anatomy of the brain is really shaped by somebody's experiences through life. And so yeah, I would imagine, whether or not it matters if you play, the Baby Einstein CDs in utero, I don't know, right? Yeah, that I don't know. But I mean, for sure, I think that there's a very strong nurture effect,
Yeah.
At least in my opinion.
There's some disease system, as you know. I don't know how prevalent it is. I don't know the technical name for it, but there is some condition where the individual does not have any ability to keep short-term memories. So, there was a movie about this. You wake up every morning and you have no memory of the previous day. and you're essentially going on like that. So do we have any sort of insights from disease states like that, how mechanistically the brain might be working?
Yeah, so most movies are about amnesia, which is the inability to form long-term memories, actually. So you can't remember what you did yesterday because it didn't make it into long-term memory. So if you're having a conversation and everything's staying in short-term memory, staying in working memory, then you're perfectly normal. But as soon as you get distracted, right, if there's a loud bang outside the window and you look over there, you would completely forget what you were talking about, and you turn back and not be able to reinstantiate the conversation from long-term memory. And so, yeah, so that is thought to be the hippocampus, which is this sort of brain region that lives kind of in the center of the cortex, and often sometimes referred to as the medial temporal lobe as well. Is this brain region that's thought to be sort of centrally important for formation of new long-term memories. And so patients who lose their hippocampus are these amnesic patients who can't remember what they did yesterday, or even basically since they lost their hippocampus, they don't have any recollection, but they have very normal working memories and short-term memory, which is interesting. So yeah, I think these two systems seem to be divided. I mean, there are some interesting. I don't know if disease is quite the right word, but there are some interesting populations of people who, for example, have trouble doing visualization, so they can't hold an image in working memory. And I think this is just starting to be really studied. And there's some interesting evidence that they actually do okay on a lot of working memory tasks, even though they can't say like picture, like at least for me, if somebody were to tell me picture a pink elephant, I can kind of draw the pink elephant in my head and see its trunk and its feet and its ears and all of that. Some people can't, and it turns out that they do fine on these working memory tasks, which is a little bit interesting. But it seems like they don't have an interaction between prefrontal cortex, which is this region that's thought to be involved in control, and visual cortex, which is a region that's thought to be involved in sort of representing visual information. That connection seems to be broken in when they're trying to remember imagine things. And so it seems to be that this sort of, you were talking before about these top-down signals, right? We talk about it as top-down because we think about prefrontal cortex, both, first of all, it's at the front of your head, and so we think of it sort of descending backwards towards the back of your head, but also top in the sense that like it's the higher cortical region. It's kind of the more cognitive region. So it sends these top-down projections into visual cortex to sort of put in kind of the visual representation, like so that you're almost actually seeing the pink elephant, right? And those seem to be broken in these people, or at least not as strong in these people. So it's interesting. So that's kind of the closest we have, I think. If you lose prefrontal cortex, if we damage prefrontal cortex, and this has happened, the most famous case of this is Phineas Gage, which I think a lot of people have sort of heard about from Psych 101. He was working on a railroad, tamping down explosives, and basically had an explosion, and that drove a railroad spike up through his prefrontal cortex and knocked out, basically obliterated prefrontal cortex. And what ends up happening in patients who don't have prefrontal cortex is they do lose a lot of these working memory abilities, but they also lose a lot of other control. So they become less directed in their behaviors. They are more impulsive, where they just kind of, if they see potato chips that they want to buy, they'll just buy them, even though they're not, hungry, or even though they're supposed to be on a diet or whatever, right? So that kind of top-down control seems to be lost. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is also a condition that you cannot forget anything, right? And I don't know what the technical name for this. Anything that comes in, you remember.
Yeah.
And so there's sort of an efficient transfer of information to long-term memory, and that is an equally problematic thing, right?
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, so people with like sort of super eidetic memories. Yeah, I don't know off the top of I can't remember off the top of my head. I would assume that has something to do with, yeah, ability to, remember things, long-term memory. So like, I don't know, better, more efficient storage of information in the hippocampus. Yeah, I don't know though. I don't know that. I'm not up on that literature. Yeah.
Yeah, so in this paper, you say our results suggest that prefrontal cortex controls cognition by dynamically transforming representations to control what and when cognitive computations are engaged. And so, one of the issues in AI today, as you know, is really not computation, it's really discarding information efficiently. What we have is just too much information. It's not lack of data, it's just too much data. One of the advantages of the brain appears to be that it's very efficient in discarding information. Um, would you think like that?
Yeah, I think that the brain is very good at sort of discovering what is important, right? And that is a key thing for any learning system, right? If you're in a new situation and you're trying to figure out, how to behave, right? So if you walk into a new restaurant, right, you don't know, is this a sit-down restaurant? Is this a fast food place, right? You're looking around and you're gathering information about that, and you're sort of using feedback from the environment. You're using rewards from the environment. Let's say whether or not you successfully ordered dinner, right, and were able to eat. That's a reward, and you use that to sort of learn. If you don't know kind of how to assign that reward, like what is the key piece of information that I should look for next time I walk into a new restaurant, then that's sort of the problem that I think a lot of the old AIs or machine learning approaches kind of face. Is how do I assign? This is called the credit assignment problem, right? How do I assign credit, learning credit to what I saw. And the brain is incredibly good at that, right? So we would quickly pick up like, okay, yeah, there's a hostess means sit down and order, whereas, a line of kiosks means fast food restaurant, right? And we kind of zoom in on that, and we don't get kind of distracted by like, oh, there's bathrooms to the right, or, different color lighting or something like that. The information that's kind of irrelevant to the task at hand, we really focus in. And so there's been like a real, I think one of the recent kind of evolutions in machine learning has been sort of developing architectures that are using more of like an attention mechanism to control exactly what both the network is looking at, but part of the reason why that's so powerful is because that's then controlling the learning signal, like where the feedback is going to in order to improve the system for the next iteration. Yeah, so I think again it comes back to this control ability and being able to focus in, attend to, or select if we're talking about working memory, focus on one thing in working memory, the relevant thing in working memory. Yeah, is I think really fundamentally important, and why we've been so interested in it, right? I mean, as for me, I'm of course interested in the brain. I'm interested in understanding how we think and how we're intelligent. But also one of the ways that we think we can apply this knowledge and make use of it is treating disease, right? But other ways is to help sort of motivate the next generation of more flexible, more general machine learning. And so, yeah, I think putting more control systems in is going to be really key to this ability.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a top-down mechanism, which we currently lack, right? When you think about deep learning networks and machine learning in general, it tends to be very bottoms up and very sort of mathematically driven. What it's lacking is sort of a top-down mechanism with I mean, in the 80s, we used to call it expert systems, a set of heuristics driving down to a decision. And that's not fashionable anymore. You know, it's very much deep learning that is currently fashionable. But I think in for practical applications, those things have a lot of drawbacks. I think. So I want to go into another paper, which is another really interesting paper. So rotational dynamics reduce interference between sensory and memory representations. Rotational dynamics. You say cognition depends on integrating sensory percepts with the memory of recent stimuli. How the distributed nature of neural coding can lead to difference between sensory and memory representations. Here we show that the brain mitigates such interference by rotating sensory representations into orthogonal memory representations over time. Could you could you explain that, Tim?
Yeah, so we were talking before about the limited capacity of working memory and the limited capacity of sensory representations and how this you're representing this the reason why is because you're representing this information over this large population where all of the neurons are kind of contributing a little bit of information about what you're remembering or what you're looking at. And it turns out, of course, as you might expect, that these two systems are, of course, interacting, right? The way that you get things into working memory or short-term memory is through sensory input, right? And so when a new sensory input comes in, it can interfere with this memory representation, just like another memory representation could interfere with that memory representation, or two sensory inputs could interfere with one another. And this becomes a real issue, particularly when you're trying to learn to make predictions in the world, right? So I think to me, probably one of the main reasons why the brain evolved was to predict what's going to happen next, right? If I can predict what's going to happen next better and more accurately than you, then like I can get there faster. I can sort of get the reward quicker, and I can grow bigger. And from an evolution perspective, that's a really great thing. And so in this case, right, what do you have to do? Well, you have to say, well, you have to learn like kind of the regularities of the world. So you learn like A is followed by B and B is followed by C. And the way that you learn this is because when A comes in, you remember it, and then when B comes in, you kind of have both of those together, and you're remembering A and B together. And so in some ways, you want these representations interacting, you want to be able to couple them together into an A-B kind of prediction. So when next time I hear A, in the classroom, I can say, oh, I know what's next, B is next, right? So how do you do this, right? So how do you have these two different things represented independently, right? So that they're not interfering too much, so that you can kind of keep them both and then be able to couple them together. So we were interested in this, and so to look at that, what we did is we had mice sitting there listening to sequences of sounds. Basically, we played them an A tone, followed by a B tone, followed by a C tone. And they just kind of like learned these sequences over time. And then we were recording neurons in auditory cortex of the mouse's brain. So this again is a brain region that's involved in kind of representing these tones. And of course, when you play an A tone, neurons in the brain will represent A really strongly, and then when you play a B tone, they'll represent B really strongly. And so in some ways, it looked like things were being overwritten, that like when A was there, it was represented, but then when you put B in, A was kind of gone, and you're no longer representing A, instead you're representing B, right? Because that's what you're hearing now. But as I was saying, that's not great because you want to be able to remember kind of what you heard in the past. And so we actually went looking to see whether or not there was any information, any memory for A. And it turns out that there was, it just was stored in a different way, right? And the sort of intuition that I think I often use to try to understand how it was stored in different ways. If you think about like a piece of paper, right? And if you write on a piece of paper and then you get to the end of the piece of paper, right? You've basically filled up the piece of paper, but you want to put something new on this piece of paper. You could go back to the top and just write over top of the old stuff, right? But that's going to cause a lot of interference. You're not really going to be able to read either the first thing that you wrote or the second thing that you wrote. So one way to handle this is you just take the piece of paper and you rotate it 90 degrees, and you start writing in the margins,
Hmm.
right? And it turns out that that's what the brain does, right? So when that A came in, it was represented as an A sensory stimulus, and then it rotated 90 degrees, right? So that piece of paper kind of rotated so that when B came in, it was now written in a different part of the neural space, right? So that there was A was still over there, it's just, and B was now kind of where A used to be, right? So it kind of moved out of the way from the new input coming in. And that allowed both of these things to be represented at the same time.
So that makes sense when you have a capacity constraint. But if you don't, you could just push off A to some other dimension, right? I mean, if you don't have a capacity constraint, that should not be an issue, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is in essence, that's what's going on, right? You're basically pushing off A into another dimension, right? So, um, uh, if we think about like the number line, right, representing kind of that first tone, um, what's happening is that the brain's rotating it so that that x-axis becomes a y-axis, and then that x-axis is now free again to represent the next thing that comes in. And so it is in its essence kind of doing what you're suggesting. It's not, you could think about this as well. Maybe what you do is you have a pool of neurons that represent, that first tone, the x-axis, right? And then you have a separate pool that represents that y-axis. And so that you basically take whatever was in that first pool and you hand it off to the second pool, and now the first pool is free to get something new put into it. In this case, that doesn't seem to be what was happening, right? So it turns out that, as we were talking about before, right, like that is one way to do it, but then each pool would have kind of half the resolution of the possible, and so it seems like actually the brain just kind of uses everything to represent A, and then it rotates it into a different dimension of that same large population. It's
So,
Yeah,
so there has
it's
to be
easy
some.
to draw. It's hard to sort of explain.
No, I get it. So there has to be some sort of localization benefit, right? So if I understand this correctly, Tim, it's a bit like the brain has a goal of creating a heuristic, and the heuristic is B comes after A, C comes after B. That's the heuristic. That's the goal of creating the heuristic. There has to be some localization benefit to create that heuristic at the point when A, B, and C are coming in. And so, if I understand this correctly, it is basically creating that heuristic orthogonal to the data input vector. Is that the way to think?
I guess so. Is your question, why is all this happening in within the same network? Why not have it
Within the
in?
same network,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, my guess, I mean, we don't know for sure, of course, but my guess is that the way that learning happens in the brain is through neurons interacting with one another. And so you want to have the same population of neurons representing both pieces of information so that they can do this interaction, and so that you can begin to make these predictions. Yeah, because I think if you separate them out, it's going to be harder for them that information to overlap, right? So again, it's kind of like one of these trade-off scenarios where it's like you want some overlapping but not too much, and yeah, and I think this could be one way that's my hypothesis, at least, that this is one way that the brain is.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, there's a lot of implications for artificial intelligence too. The architectures that we pursue today have none of these features, actually, right? So if
Yeah.
if there are advantages here, perhaps this could be embedded into silicon at some point. So I want to finish up with another paper, Toward a Neurobiology of Internal Selective Attention. You say a recent study of non-human primates brings the investigation of selective attention within visual working memory to the systems and cellular neuroscience levels. You say we reflect on the breakthrough of nearly 20 years of related research in humans and highlight some of the lessons to help future work. So let me ask you in conclusion, where do you think we are going with this research? If you sort of look forward 5, 10 years, what is the area that you are sort of most excited about? Where do you think we will make sort of the most interesting leaps forward?
Yeah, so that paper was actually written. I just want to clarify that it was written by Kia Nobre, who's she's a professor at Oxford. She was talking about some of our work in that. And I think, you know, what she was sort of highlighting there is that there is these questions I think are of how do you control in the brain, how do you control neural representations? Have been studied for a long time, of course, and there's just been, I think, incremental progress, and our work is just one more step, I think, in this process. I think, to me, where the field's going that I'm really excited about is the understanding the brain and understanding computation from a dynamical point of view, right? So as you were sort of alluding to before, right, if we think about most machine learning systems now, they're very static, right? Input comes in, output goes out. And in contrast, behavior, right, and the brain is highly dynamic, right? Part of this is because the brain's very recurrent, right? So, you know, inputs come into the eye, they go up into the visual system, which then eventually goes up into the prefrontal cortex, and then it goes right back down and from prefrontal cortex back into the visual system. So there's all these loops everywhere in the brain. And what this means is that things evolve and change over time. And it's been very hard, I think, to get a hold of these dynamics and understand these dynamics. And because they really, in part because you have to record a lot of neurons simultaneously. And so we're just, as a field, you know, we've been chipping away at this problem. And I think we were recording from, 100 neurons, and now we're starting to record from 200 neurons or 1,000 neurons. And I think eventually we'll continue to get to the grow number of neurons that we're recording to really be able to look at these dynamics and understand how are things evolving, how are things changing, how are things communicating and talking to one another. Different brain regions are talking to one another, and what role is all this playing in cognition and in the computation of us being able to produce all of this sort of flexible general intelligence. And so I think I'm really excited about that, and sort of seeing it already has become, a really big part of the field, and I think, but just continuing to see it grow as a contribution. And I think, again, thinking back to sort of practically how this is going to influence people's lives, I think as we integrate these dynamics, we'll understand a lot more about how to treat disease, right? Because, again, it's not that a lot of these diseases are not static, right? They're not, they don't express themselves in the same way at every single moment in time. Instead, they're also very dynamic processes. And so I think when we think about how do we treat them, we have to think about treating them in a way that interfaces with these dynamics and changes over time. And then also, from bringing it to bear in artificial intelligence and continuing to improve machine learning with all of the, I think, implications that has for improving, society and human lives, right? Again, I think we just need to bring some of these dynamics to those systems, and part of that's going to be understanding how they work in the brain, so that we can kind of design them in a sensible way, I think, in AI.
Yeah, two big fields: brain diseases and artificial intelligence. And you're sitting sort of at the intersection of both of these, right? Understanding memory, understanding computing mechanisms. Clearly, we haven't figured out the architecture.
Yeah, we have a long way to go.
We have a long way to go.
Yeah.
So,
no,
excellent.
it's what makes neuroscience so much fun, is that I think there's so much to do, and also it's just so many cool questions.
Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Tim. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Yeah, thank you.